This video is sponsored by Sunflex UK. You want to own your own home, but it costs too much. The UK housing market is crazy and you can't afford to buy a house. But what if you could afford to build one? What if self-building is the answer to first-time homeownership? Could someone earning an average wage in the UK afford to build their own first step on the housing ladder? This all comes down to budget. So the challenge I set myself making this video was to design the cheapest possible detached house that can legally be built in the UK. I've been designing homes in the UK for almost 2 decades, and when you boil it all down, there are just 2 things that will determine the cost of any building: the size of that building and the construction methods used to build it. I've spent years designing high-end homes, so this will be a genuine challenge. None of my clients ask me to make anything like this. To get the construction costs as low as possible, I need to keep the house as small as legally possible. I'm going to design a detached house with a single bedroom built using the cheapest legit methods and materials. Are you with me so far? Good. Let's start with the construction materials and methods first, because that's the easy bit. The first thing to realize is that foundations are expensive. You are literally shoveling thousands of pounds into a hole in the ground. The house must have some kind of foundation, but it's not unusual for 15 to 20% of the overall cost of a one-story house to be buried underground. So how do we keep the foundation cost as low as possible? The answer is to use a post and beam frame construction on pad foundations. It's more usual for homes in the UK to have a load-bearing external wall with foundations under the full length. Quite often, a solid concrete floor slab is also built for the ground floor, and this is filled with expensive plastic insulation. So, none of that for our house. We will use a suspended timber floor with mineral wool insulation packed between the timbers. The external walls of our house will be made from timber frame. This is a common construction method in Scotland where I work, but they are almost always covered in brick or block on the outside. That masonry isn't load-bearing. Property developers only do it that way because that's what people expect a house to look like. It's the timber frame walls that actually hold up the roof, not the blockwork. Our walls will sit on a beam that spans between posts, and these posts will be secured to 6 concrete pad foundations, each about 1 meter square. I did consider using ground screws, but it might not be possible to get a structural engineer to sign these off for a habitable structure. Fine for a garden shed, but keep in mind we want to do this legally. The cheapest roof will be a shallow mono-pitch with mineral wool insulation at ceiling level. Now we have the basic frame of the building, we need to discuss materials. We need these to be competent while still being as cheap as possible inside and out. For the outer walls, we need a material that is cheap to buy, quick to install, and doesn't need any further work once fixed to the building. I considered using pine cladding, but that needs to be painted, so instead I went with this PVC cladding system. For the internal surfaces, I wanted to keep the number of trades to an absolute minimum. Wet trades like plasterers and decorators take time and cost money, so they are out. I wanted a surface material that covers a large area quickly and doesn't need any further work. There are lots of great options on the market, but I went for, you guessed it, PVC again. Remember, the challenge here is to keep the costs to an absolute minimum, not to create a memorable space. Well, it might be memorable, but for the wrong reasons. I should also point out that neither the internal or external wall materials are fire resistant. That limits the option to locate the house within 6 meters of any boundary. If you want to build this house on a tiny site where any part of the house might be less than 6 meters from the boundary, then the internal surfaces and external cladding need to be fire rated. This limits the choice of materials. Essentially, the inner face of the walls and ceiling will have to be finished in plasterboard, and the external cladding needs to be fire resistant. If this were built less than 1 meter from a boundary, that fire rating gets even more onerous. It doesn't matter what's on the other side of that boundary, or that our house is only 1 story tall. After the Grenfell tragedy, fire regulations across the UK have been tightened, and this limits the building materials we can use. Looking for inspiration from buildings designed before this, or ones built outside the UK, can lead to disappointment. In a lot of cases, they used materials that we just can't. The size of the site would also matter if it is in a rural location, because it won't have access to a sewer and will need a septic tank instead, and those have to be kept at least 5 meters from the house and also from the boundary, so you wind up with a large area of ground you cannot build on. For the roof, I could use single ply membrane or zinc, but they are expensive, so instead I'm using bituminous felt. This stuff has been around a long time. It's old school. In fact, it was on the roof of my old school, but it's hard wearing and cheaper than any alternative. I should also point out these materials may cause problems for mortgage lenders. I recently interviewed a mortgage broker for the channel, and he told me some lenders set limits on the amount of cladding or flat roof material on any new building. I'm hoping the overall cost of this house will be so low that you might not need a mortgage. Let's keep going and see if we can get there. Now we've fleshed out the bones of the building. What about the layout? Remember I said at the beginning how size determines the cost of any building? Well, how do we determine the minimum legal size of a house? It turns out this isn't as easy as I thought. I imagined I would look this up and get a quick, simple answer, but no such luck. Up until now, I had been dealing with practical construction issues, but now we have to get into detailed planning guidance and building regulations. I previously made a video about the difference between the planning system and the building regulations. There's a link in the description if you want to see more, but you can think of it like the distinction between your car tax and your car insurance. They do different things and you need them both. The planning system in the UK has national space standards for new dwellings. That's houses or flats. This document sets out a minimum size of 37 square metres for a one-bed dwelling, so long as it has a shower rather than a bath. Now that's pretty small, little more than 6 metres by 6, but I soon discovered that the national space standards are not mandatory. Some local authorities have not adopted them, and others have made it possible for developers to argue against using them in certain circumstances. The RIBA and others have argued that minimum space standards should be written into the building regulations instead of planning guidance. I have to say I agree, but where does that leave me on my quest to design the smallest legally possible house in the UK? Well, if you're in a part of the UK where the local authority has not adopted the national space standards, you can build smaller than 37 square metres. A lot smaller. It comes down to the building regulations alone, and these are different in England and Scotland, as well as Wales and Northern Ireland. Part M of the English building regulations has lots of useful guidance on minimum sizes for bedrooms and kitchens, but these only seem to apply if the property has at least 2 bedrooms. And as far as I can tell, Part M doesn't discuss how small a single-bed property should be. The Scottish building regulations, however, have something called an enhanced apartment. This is the minimum size living space that can be designed into a property. It must be at least 3 metres wide and have 12 square metres of space free of any kitchen units. It's possible the enhanced apartment space could be used as the basis for a bedsit, where the living space doubles as a bedroom. The Scottish regulations also ask that a kitchen have at least 1 cubic metre of storage space. That works out at about 3 floor-mounted cupboards or 6 wall-mounted cupboards. The regs in both England and Scotland set activity space sizes for shower rooms. Essentially, there must be a space 80 centimetres by 110 centimetres in front of a toilet, and the same at the doorway leading into the shower room. Taking all these requirements into account, this is the layout I came up with. It's 3 metres wide internally, and the living space is 4 metres from the kitchen units to the back wall, so 12 square metres for the enhanced apartment. The sofa doubles as a fold-out bed. The kitchen will have its 1 cubic metre of storage, and the shower room has been designed as tight as possible to comply with the regs. You can see the door and might be wondering, where's the window? Well, under the Scottish building regulations, the minimum amount of glazing required to any habitable room must equal 1/15 its floor area. Our kitchen and living space is 13.8 square metres combined, so if the door were glazed, it would exceed the minimum requirements for daylight, and the shower room doesn't require any natural light under the regs. Now might be the right time to mention the sponsor of today's video. Sunflex UK design and manufacture high-quality aluminium windows and doors. I made this video explaining how their products enhanced this project of mine. Check out the link up here or in the description below. So there it is, in all its glory, the smallest legit detached house design in the UK. What we have here is little more than a mobile home or static caravan. It's hard to believe something like this could legally be built as a permanent house. But given all the small print I mentioned above, it seems to be legit. If anyone else watching this has seriously looked into this, or if you think I've made an error interpreting the building regulations, let me know about it in the comments. Like I said at the start, I've never had to look into doing this before. I find it hard to believe a house like this is possible, and I seriously doubt anyone would bother. After all, if you can get planning permission to build a house, the site will automatically be worth quite a lot of money on the open market. My suspicion is that building this house might actually devalue the site. But what would it cost to build? That's what we all came to find out, so let's look at the construction costs. Now, before anyone starts talking about prefabrication or shipping containers, let's get a few things straight. Prefabrication only works if the factory can mass produce the design. Otherwise, building this house off-site would probably cost more than employing contractors to build it on-site. A shipping container is not as wide or as tall as our house. In fact, I wish the whole shipping container craze would just die. If these things were the answer to our housing crisis, we would already be using them. But we're not, because they're crap. There, I said it. Before I made this video, I surveyed the channel members, and a majority thought the cheapest possible detached house design in the UK should be about £100,000, and 2/3 of members believed it should cost at least £70,000. I broke down the materials and labour and got the following costs. Some of this involves making assumptions, and it doesn't include the cost of connecting the house to gas, water, electric, or drainage. Drumroll please. The cost to build the cheapest house in the UK is £27,000. This works out at about £1,600 per square metre. Even if you live in part of the UK where the National Space Standards applies, and you had to build at least 37 square metres of space, it should cost about £59,000 to build a house using the same cheap-as-chips materials and methods. Because land with planning permission is so scarce in this country, it's almost certain a house built like this would cost less than the site. And this illustrates just how crazy our housing system is. It's not the construction costs that keep house prices high and rising. It's the availability of land. I've posted the full breakdown of costs to my Instagram account, along with the floor plan and 3D images. There's a link in the description below, so check it out. I'm not suggesting for a moment that anyone should do this. This might be the first time I've designed something I don't actually want anyone to build. What I learned from this exercise is that our building regulations should adopt the National Space Standards and not leave it to local planning departments to implement minimum sizes for our homes. My name is Neil, and I've been a real-life architect in the UK since 2009. I enjoyed this little exercise in value engineering. I don't often get to do this in my day job. Hit the like button if you found it useful, and if you have any questions or observations, please post them in the comments, and I will do my best to answer them.